Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Regulation Navigation, brought to you by ITS. This is a webinar series centered around regulation-related topics, and we cover high-level compliance requirements and give an opportunity for you to learn something new, validate what you may already know, and ask questions affecting your operations. I'm Chris Taylor. I'm the ITS Vice President of Learning and Product. And today we're delighted to have Erin Kurilla of the American Public Gas Association join us to discuss the 28 regulatory notices that came from the U.S. Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, commonly referred to as PHMSA, that were published in July, as well as some other pending regulatory actions. So we're going to review the various types of the regulatory actions that were announced, when they'll become effective, and how they may affect your operations or impact them. We'll also touch on some of the latest compliance-related news affecting the industry. But before we get started, just some housekeeping items to ensure the experience is beneficial for all of us. This session will be recorded, and our recordings are posted in the days following airing of the webinar to our website at its-training.com. As a gentle reminder, the information and views expressed in this webinar series may be opinion and do not constitute legal advice and should not be utilized as your only source of information. So please review the disclaimer on screen before acting on any advice given and seek guidance from legal counsel or other applicable experts if you have particular questions, issues, or concerns. We'll have time at the end of the session, or we hope so. This one's chock full. Where you can anonymously ask questions about the topics that we discussed today. So please type those questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll address those as time permits or respond to you through email if you leave your contact information. So we're offering 0.1 CEUs or continuing education units. You may be able to apply to your professional development hours. So after the webinar, we'll send out a recap email with a feedback form that you can fill out, return to us if you'd like a certificate for those CEU credits. So besides the July notices from PHMSA and some related updates that we're going to cover with Erin, we do have some few other news items to cover right off the top. So first of all, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, just published an investigation report for a May 2024 natural gas fueled explosion in Youngstown, Ohio, which unfortunately killed one person and injured 9 others while causing significant structural damage. Link in the chat, as you saw there, so you can go see the report itself, much more details. But the NTSB determined the blast was caused by a scrap crew cutting into an active service line that had been mistakenly documented as abandoned by the pipeline operator years earlier. And unfortunately, that allowed gas to leak and then unfortunately ignite. Following the accident, the pipeline operator updated their safety procedures and launched a large-scale review and correction of its abandoned pipeline records, and luckily uncovering multiple still active lines through that effort. So as an industry, we can always learn from others' misfortunes and make the entirety of our systems safer. So encourage you to read that and share and disseminate and reflect on, what could this happen to me? Another topic, PHMSA issued a new final rule just 2 weeks ago titled Periodic Standards Update 2. This is updating 19 voluntary consensus industry technical standards, which are incorporated by reference within the pipeline safety regulations and become effective next year on January 10th. So we're not going to jump in depth into these specifics in this webinar, but see the link that we just provided in the chat and in our recap email to follow for those details. However, we will be covering the concept of incorporation by reference, or IBR, later in our program today. PHMSA has announced, in other news, its first ever, reportedly, published set of inspection enforcement priorities. So they expect to sharpen its focus on areas with the greatest impact to pipeline safety, Outlined in a new memorandum, the priorities include focusing on incidents and accidents, high and moderate consequence areas, control room management, leak detection, damage prevention, and transactions and due diligence. So acting PHMSA Administrator Ben Kochman underscored that operators will continue to be held to, quote, the highest, most stringent safety standards, and the agency won't hesitate to use every enforcement tool at their disposal when those standards aren't met. PHMSA inspectors are expected to prioritize inspections for compliance with recent rulemakings on rupture mitigation valves, materials verification, maximum allowable operating pressure reconfirmation, and underground natural gas storage safety. So watch out for those areas of focus. A couple of weeks ago, PHMSA published a notice requesting comments on its plan to revise the instructions for the Incident Report Form F7100.2 to provide clarity on reporting the intentional release of gas through relief valves and through emergency shutdown devices. In the notice, PHMSA has adopted language from trade associations who proposed when gas is released through a relief valve or a compressor station has an emergency shutdown system and devices opened at the specified set points or conditions, that release of gas is considered intentional. The deadline for comments is coming up September 12th, and you can see the link in the chat. Encourage you to learn more and contribute to the conversation. In another recent PHMSA notice, an immediately binding advisory bulletin announced that the agency has rescinded a previous advisory bulletin concerning the provisions in Section 114 of the 2020 Pipes Act. The bulletin was issued back The original bulletin was issued back in June 2021, which required operators to update their O&M or operations and maintenance procedures to address both an unintentional and intentional methane emissions. This directive was treated as a self-executing mandate and led many state regulators to request documentation from operators explaining how their systems addressed methane emissions. So with the announcement, this is no longer a requirement federally for operators, noting the bulletin went beyond the scope of what Congress's original intent or direction was. Now moving on to today's topic with our guest, and we're so lucky to have her. You may have noticed this summer that PHMSA sent out a flurry of regulatory announcements on July 1st. There were 28 related to pipeline safety in the Federal Register on that day, which is quite out of the ordinary for PHMSA, at least in recent years. So Erin Kurilla is certainly not a new face to this program or to the industry. I welcome her. Erin is the Executive Vice President of Advocacy and Operations at the American Public Gas Association, who works closely with public-owned natural gas utilities member systems to continuously improve their safety and reliability of our nation's distribution pipeline infrastructure. And Erin also often collaborates with other industry stakeholder groups such as the American Gas Association on joint industry public comments to rulemaking. Erin, again, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Today, we're focusing in particular those 28 pipeline safety related notices issued in the Federal Register July 1st this year. And your experience being so close to the rulemaking process, is this unprecedented to see this much action on a single day from PHMSA?
Yes, to call it straight up, yes, it's certainly unprecedented. Although I definitely think it's symbolic of the agency leadership that is there now and their depth of knowledge on pipeline safety regulation. I guess it's no surprise that they walked in the door and knew some things that they wanted to accomplish right out of the gate. And so they walked in ready, they walked in knowing where there was kind of low-hanging fruit for improvements and efficiency in the regulations, and they hit the ground running. And so certainly unprecedented, but somewhat not surprising knowing the cast of characters that are over there at PHMSA now.
That makes sense. Well, let's break down these notices that came down on July 1st into some more kind of manageable categories for our conversation today. Will you break those down for us?
Sure. I think of them, there's really different types of agency action, right? So when we look at the 28 in the large buckets, there were 20 direct final rules, there were 2 technical amendments or corrections, and there were 6 notices of proposed rulemaking. Within the direct final rules, there were, as you can see on the slides here, 16 incorporations by reference and 4 kind of, we'll call them the potpourri of other direct final rules. And I know Chris will walk through a lot of those as we progress during today's webinar.
Thank you. So we're dealing with different kinds of changes, and I'd imagine some may be more significant than others, and some will affect different segments of the industry, as is typical. But we also have, different timelines, different levels of certainty based on what's called adverse public comment, and I know you'll touch on that in a minute. But can you give our audience an overview of, each type of the rulemaking action?
Sure.
Yeah.
So most of us are accustomed to kind of the standard course of business, which is typically PHMSA will issue a request for comment utilizing an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. This is usually our first indication that the agency is contemplating a new regulation. They would like to gather input from all the stakeholder groups that might be impacted from the new regulation. And it's usually a series of questions. What do you think we should do on X? Is this a problem? And how do you think we should solve it, right? So that's an advance notice of proposed rulemaking or an ANPRM. Once they gather all that information, the agency sits down and they work with their technical staff and their general counsel's office and everyone in between, and they write a notice of proposed rulemaking. That's our first glimpse into what the agency is really thinking about changing in the actual Part 192 or 195 regulation. That is then where you see the stakeholder groups engage deeply and provide really comprehensive and technical comments, both on the proposals that the agency is laying out, as well as the justification that the agency has provided for the proposals. So that's an NPRM, a notice of proposed rulemaking. Once the agency gathers all that information, right, then they move towards a final rule. That's typically how we see the agency move. However, they do have other agency actions at their fingertips that they can utilize. And one of those is the direct final rule. As you can see on your screen, this is really meant to be a tool that allows agencies to make kind of quick changes that are, quote, non-controversial, as in no one's gonna care if we make this change. And they will go into effect on the date that is provided on that direct final rule unless adverse comments are received. And that's an Administrative Procedures Act. That's something that is not unique to PHMSA. That's across many different agencies around town. They are allowed to use a direct final rule only so long as no adverse comments are received. There's two other kinds of agency actions you can see there. They kind of feel somewhat synonymous to most of us, which is a technical amendment or a technical correction. Correction, as you can see, is kind of even more granular, perhaps a typo. I've seen it used where, oh no, they listed kind of the wrong date somewhere, or maybe a wrong cross-reference within the code. It was truly an error and they're just going in and fixing it. Whereas a technical amendment is, hey, this wasn't quite clear. We want to fix the language in the regulation, not to substantively change the requirement, but instead make it more clear to the regulated community. And so lots of different tools in the toolbox for the agency, but we really saw them come out of the gate, again, with these direct final rules, technical amendments, and technical corrections, and then a handful of very pointed notices of proposed rulemaking.
Well, before we dive into those, let's do, and you kind of did this in the types, but
Yeah.
the basic primer of the processor, especially what it looks like for pipeline safety.
Sure. Yeah, sorry about that. I forgot we had this
No,
slide
you're good. You're
next.
good. Yeah, this is
So
much more
if we
detailed.
really were to go just to, I guess, your left of the drafting of a proposed rule, that's where the ANPRM kind of lives, if we were to kind of put it before the start here. Once we work through and make it to our notices of proposed rulemaking, what I talked about where PHMSA is really gathering all that input from stakeholder groups, that's where that magical gas pipeline advisory committee meeting or meetings, right? Sometimes if the rulemaking is large enough, there's multiples of those. That's where that happens. And so, one thing that, we often wonder, what is the agency up to? What is taking it so long? Why is there so much time in between when a comment period closes or when a GPAC meeting concludes and when we see a final rule? And that's because welcome to the federal government. There are so many other checks that must happen when any agency in town is promulgating a rule. And that's where it needs to go up to the boss's office, right? It needs to go up to the Secretary of Transportation, but it also has to go over to the White House in the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. I feel like before the past kind of 8 months or so, no one had ever heard of OMB, but now, I mean, I think you can turn on your favorite news station and hear about that office now because they really do hold the keys to the federal rulemaking process or regulatory process. They're the ones that are really checking to make sure and keeping agencies in check as far as is the benefits to society for an agency to issue a new rule outweighed by the cost it will bear on those that have to meet that new regulation. So OMB is that kind of final check. All right, agency, I know you want to do all these wonderful things, is the benefit outweighed by the burden on the regulated community? And they're that final check before a final rule comes out of the agency.
Thank you for digging into that. Yeah, that it jumps from NPRM to final rule and there's a lot that goes on in between. That's
Absolutely.
clarity. Well, speaking of GPAC, I know PHMSA just issued a call for nominations for that committee over this past weekend. Just wanted to mention that here. Didn't make it into the news section, but now that we've primed the process, let's jump into the technical correction and amendment items that were issued in July. So first, let's look at the technical amendment, which I believe is a new incorporation by reference, or IBR, of the 2018 edition of the American Society of Mechanical Engineering Gas Transmission and Distribution Piping Systems, known commonly as ASME B31.8S. Before we get into that, let's talk about IBR in general real quick. So I believe PHMSA incorporates more than 80 industry standards by reference into the pipeline safety regulations. Erin, what does it mean when a standard is IBR, and why do regulators utilize this?
Yeah, so anyone on this call knows how regulated of an industry we all work in, right? We know not that I'm doing this at dinner parties very often, but in case anyone asks what I do for a living, right? People are somewhat surprised. I guess it's a little surprising that they're surprised that when I explain that, hey, listen, from how we design pipelines to how we construct to the materials that are used to how they are operated and maintained, shoot, even how they are kind of reach end of life, right? All of that is regulated by the federal government. And people are surprised to hear that, right? And that is why we have such both prescriptive and performance-based regulations for the assets that you all operate and maintain. But it gets really technical really fast in ways that our federal government kind of recognizes that they've got to phone a friend, right? And so what IBR allows them to do is really rely upon those consensus standards that are written by the subject matter experts through a ANSI regulated process, right? So they have to have a balanced working group. It has to go out for ballot. There's all sorts of rules. Anyone, and I kind of scanned the attendee list. A lot of you guys are really involved in some of these standards. And so you guys know better than anyone the rigor around those processes. And so there is a recognition by PHMSA that, hey, listen, when it comes to welding procedures or fusion procedures on plastic pipe, we've got to kind of rely upon the experts. And instead of trying to copy and paste different elements of those standards that have been developed, let's just incorporate the whole thing by reference. And so there's a long history of that by PHMSA, and they are certainly obviously not the only agency in town that does that. But it really allows the agency to focus on areas kind of between those standards instead of trying to kind of rewrite something that so many subject matter experts have already worked on.
Thank you for that explainer, and that makes a lot of sense. So this technical amendment specifically is incorporating repair criteria, I believe, for onshore transmission pipelines from ASME B31-8S,
Yeah.
specifically on evaluation and remediation timelines for those repairs. Erin, what's the impact of incorporating this?
Sure. So I'm going to confess, right? I live pretty far downstream, right? As in, I work mostly on distribution pipe, and any transmission knowledge I have is from living through the gas transmission rule from whatever 2013 through 2021, and also obviously following it as a member of our industry. But um, I will say B31.8S has been incorporated by reference for a long time as far as how it governs the integrity management for both transmission and kind of the governing approach to distribution integrity management as well. When the 2018 version was developed and published by ASME, it did include a lot of sections related to repair criteria. So thinking dents, gouges, scratches, etc., various types of corrosion. And when PHMSA promulgated the gas transmission rule 2, right, which looked at repair criteria both inside HCAs via your transmission integrity management plan as well as outside HCAs through the 710 section, right? PHMSA, I guess, paused on updating the repair criteria section of the incorporation by reference. If you look at the 192.7 where B31.8S is incorporated, you'll see all the code sections listed on where the 2018 version is to be utilized and where the previous versions are to be utilized. And that is because coming out of the second gas transmission rule, there were stakeholders that essentially petitioned PHMSA to re-examine some of the repair criteria that they had promulgated through that second rule that ended up being litigated. And while that litigation was underway, it would have kind of put the cart before the horse to fully incorporate the 2018 version. Now that that litigation has been settled and the agency is able to move forward, now they're ready to bring in that 2018 version. And again, I like to use my disclaimer here because there is a lot to know, and I know there are people on this line that know more than me on this specific incorporation by reference in the long saga history of how it kind of got to be piecemealed and now is being fully incorporated. So, yeah, I'm sure someone can get in your inbox, Chris, and share more on the subject, but that is the overarching, that's what kind of the average person should know. But if you do operate transmission line, if you are responsible for really understanding the repair timelines and the repair triggers, you certainly should check out the 2018 version and ensure that your internal operating procedures and I guess investigation procedures for anomalies are aligned.
Well, thank you for the high level and the history on that. Um, Next, we have a technical correction. It's amending MAOP verification requirements in 192.624 to clarify that for pressure tests performed prior to 1970, an operator is not expected to have each of the specific information that's listed in 517A for records to be considered traceable, verifiable, and complete. Erin, comments for this one are due coming up next week, I believe, on September 8th.
Mhm.
What's the significance of this correction?
It's incredibly significant. And I'm really curious to see how this whole thing is going to play out. Um, Again, I'm going to rely upon my kind of back file archived brain power here for really going back to that 2015, 2016 timeframe when we were contemplating which pipelines would be required to perform an MAOP reconfirmation, right? So going all the way back to the applicability of 192.624. And there was a subset of pipelines that were not utilizing the grandfather clause, right? Not utilizing whatever 192.619C that had received, but were installed prior to 1970. Meaning, hey, I'm an operator. Maybe I installed this pipe in 1963 and I pressure tested it. I did an 8-hour pressure test. For all intents and purposes, I feel like I have a valid pressure test, right? But guess what didn't exist in 1963? Pipeline safety regulations, and certainly not subpart J, which dictates both how to perform a pressure test and, importantly, what records should be maintained for a pressure test. 192.517, right? And so now this pipeline is kind of in limbo, right? I have what I believe to be a valid pressure test. I just don't happen to have the exact records that would eventually be the expectation for the records. And so, yeah, thanks. Showing you kind of where PHMSA believes they have offered a technical correction. Hey, listen, I can only require you to have 517A records if you performed the pressure test per this regulation, right? And so this is intended to be a technical correction and say, hey, listen, we're not talking about those 1963 pipe that you have good records for, but maybe not compliant records for. That's not the pipe we're worried about. We're worried about pipe that has no records or pipe that was never pressure tested, right? And so trying to kind of narrow and really apply, I guess, kind of a risk-based filter on which pipeline should be required to undergo a 192.624 MAOP reconfirmation. Just as far as where this technical correction stands, as Chris, you mentioned, it did receive a comment from a public stakeholder group that felt like this was not a technical correction, but instead a modified, I guess, interpretation from the agency. And they filed comments to that effect. And so now PHMSA decided to open it up for further public comment. Those comments are due on September 8th. I know my partners here in DC that work on transmission pipeline issues are putting together really comprehensive comments on this in response. This is a long history. I kind of will laugh at almost myself at this point because in a conversation with the other trade associations, they were like, there was this person named Erin Kurilla back in 2015 that made a comment at a GPAC meeting that said, how can an operator be expected to have records when the records requirement didn't even exist? And so this is a long, we're on what year is it, 2025? It's been going on probably for more than 10 years at this point since MAOP reconfirmation even became a subject of conversation coming out of San Bruno. But we'll see where this lands. I know there are a lot of pipeline operators that built a lot of pipe in the 60s, and so they are really interested in how this will shake out.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for taking part of the process. Credit.
Some people have been around longer than me will tell you some of these issues we'll spend our entire careers talking about, and this feels like one of them for sure.
Thank you again. Now let's switch gears to our direct final rules that we received on July 1st. There were 4 of them. And first, there's the due date for DOT annual reporting will be pushed back 3 months from typically it's been March 15th to now June 15th, effective as of this October and beginning next year, unless adverse comments were received by, I believe, yesterday. Erin, how do you see this impacting the industry?
I mean, for some people, the March 15th date wasn't a big deal. Usually, like APGA members, smaller systems, they were able to button up all their records by March 15th. I know for other multi-state, significantly more mileage, obviously discontiguous, non-contiguous, I should say, systems. It was hard sometimes to get everything buttoned up by March 15th. So they were requesting extensions on their annual report submission. I suspect the agency said, hey, instead of having, so many requests for extension, let's just bump it to June 15th. And then that way everybody can get it in at the same time. Probably just reduces paperwork burden on people requesting for extension and stuff like that. So it's helpful, right? But probably not required for everyone, right? So
Sometimes it's the little things, I guess.
yeah, yeah.
Well, next we have allowing remote sensing technologies such as unmanned aerial systems and satellites, specifying they can be used as a method for patrols of gas transmission pipelines. And Aaron, I believe some of these technologies are already being used in the industry. What do you think PHMSA is signaling here?
Yeah, I think that this is a very pointed signal to the industry on where the current administration, the current PHMSA administration stands on technology adoption. This has been the idea of technology adoption and how it tugs and pulls with regulation compliance, compliance with regulations has been something that our industry has struggled with, I think. This idea of I cannot incorporate or I will not incorporate this new technology because it hasn't been wholesale embraced by the federal or state regulator is something I think has plagued us and it's really held back. We talked, all right, I think my first comment was about how regulated we are, right?
Mhm.
And when regulations begin to bear weight on technology adoption, I don't think pipeline safety is the winner in that equation. And so I appreciate the agency saying, hey, listen, aerial systems, satellites, there's a lot of technology out there for leak detection. We should be all of the above instead of the whole picking winners and losers, right? And so I appreciate that this is just kind of one corner of the regulation, right? Leak detection, where the agency's saying, hey, listen, go out and use what's available. We don't want to be the ones that inhibit your adoption and utilization of the technology. And I'll be curious if I think the whole special permit conversation we're going to have later is kind of in that same vein, right? Is they're ready to see the age or to see the industry using best available technology to kind of use that term versus wait on the agency to be the ones that gets to decide. So,
Awesome to see, anything that's tackling stifling of innovation.
right.
Next, we have the revising of the definition of the word incident in 191.3 to clarify that the costs associated with obtaining permits and removing or replacing infrastructure undamaged by an event don't need to be considered when calculating estimated property damage. Aaron, what's the significance of this one to operators?
Yeah, this one caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting it. I don't know where they got the idea from, but I like it because I think, again, I mean, I guess if I think about knowing again the administration over at PHMSA now, the new folks there. I know that there has been always a topic of conversation. What do we think about when we think about pipeline safety performance as an industry? What we look at incidents, right? Like that, what else can we, I mean, I know there's a lot of different metrics we can use, but that's obviously a huge metric. How are we doing on safety? Well, how many incidents do we have? And I think there's a lot of people. In fact, there's a workshop in 2 weeks on data metrics that PHMSA is going to host in Houston on the 18th and 19th. And this is a panel that several of us are going to sit on is this idea of incident reporting and what is the noise around that data metric and versus what is really meaningful. And I feel like this was one place where they saw an opportunity to kind of filter out the noise. Obviously, if there is a death or an injury that results in a hospitalization or significant property damage, it meets the incident definition per 191.3. But there was I guess, an identified issue where so many, especially excavation damages, were reaching the the property damage threshold due to really just paving activities versus actual impacts of the excavation damage that they decided to try to filter this out. I also think it's probably because of how much more data they're getting on the distribution annual report now due to excavation damages that there was a sense that, hey, we're going to gather all this wonderful, important root cause excavation damage information over here. Let's not worry about capturing those type of damages in an incident report if we're going to capture it in the annual report.
Some data cleaning by a policy, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Finally, of the direct final rules, there's revising PHMSA's administrative procedures for enforcement and regulation to clarify that for the purposes of filing and compliance deadlines, days do not include weekends or federal holidays. So Erin, how did this one fare with public comments? And do you think this will help
Yeah, I
clarify?
think this is a true direct final rule, just kind of cleaning it up, I think is all. I've teased with PHMSA career staff for years that they love to do things right around the holidays. And so I don't think I had anything to do with them deciding to do this, but I'm sure I'm not the only one that has felt that way. And so I appreciate them recognizing like dropping something, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving or something like that kind of sucks if it's a 30-day comment deadline. So appreciate
Get
them
those days
recognizing
back,
it.
yeah. Well, now I think that brings us to the part of direct final rules that are all updates to sections of the federal code, which are incorporated by reference. And we have 16 of those. And as we mentioned before, these are industry consensus standard documents that are continuously being updated by their respective working groups and their publishing organizations. PHMSA is kind of just playing catch up here, right? What's the typical cadence of IBR updates?
I wish there was a typical cadence. There
Yeah,
really
so do
isn't. Um, Thinking about the PHMSA rulemaking staff, I feel like they think of updated to incorporation by reference as kind of the monkey on their back. Um, because the way it has always worked, or I shouldn't say always, the way and the best in my career, the way it has always worked is as a consensus standard is updated, then the agency relies upon their own internal subject matter experts to discern whether or not the PHMSA, the agency, likes the new version, right? So it goes through this whole updating process, balloting, voting, comment resolution, right? Through the ANSI process it's finalized, it's published, and then the agency decides if they like it or not, right? And I'm kind of being a little bit facetious there. And some of them are very, very technical, some are more broad programmatic type standards. And so, depending upon the capabilities, the technical expertise at the agency, as well as really, I guess, how much attention a standard gets, has really dictated how quickly the agency gets on board with the newly published standard. And that varies, right? And it's never ending for the agency. And they have frankly, I mean, they'll tell you, struggled to keep up. And so I see these 16 direct final rules again as this administration's signal as we're not going to be the holdup anymore. If a standard that is open to the public, open to public participation, open to public comment, etc. If that is published and in the eyes of the subject matter experts that are participating on that standard is the best version of that standard. If it's been updated and published, it's the best version of that standard that those subject matter experts and public feel, right? Um, is it really the agency's place to review that? Or should the agency simply open it up for public comment, one more time as an incorporation by reference rulemaking? And that's functionally what they did. They said, hey, we think these are direct final rules. We don't think that there's going to be adverse comments on it. You had your chance during the standards making process to file comments. We'll give you one last shot through the direct final rule kind of process. Otherwise, let's go. Let's start incorporating these. And so, yeah, there's my long-winded answer on that one.
That's a
Sorry.
good one, though. I,
Yeah.
I love I just wish there was a cadence. Maybe there'll be a few ones. We have 16 of these to review, and we're going to batch them together a bit. And, we're not going to go into the substantive detail into each of these, but let's start with the American Society for Testing and Materials, or ASTM. Erin, when you work with your member operators, distribution operators, What's the typical process for reviewing and ensuring compliance with standards that are incorporated by reference?
It's tricky. I find I was again on the line yesterday with the other industry trades in town, and let me tell you, we're all struggling, especially with the quantity, right? We mentioned the standards update 2 that just published, as well as all these 16 direct final rules. It's a lot for the industry to kind of unpack and really do these side-by-side comparisons. Um, One, I'll say we're all thinking about how to provide better resources to the industry. We have to be careful of copyright laws up and until they're available for public consumption, which any standard that is fully incorporated by reference, and I guess in effect, right, is available for the public to view. But that's still hard. That's tricky, right? And so we've been thinking about how we can all kind of come together, whether across all the different industry trades through the full value chain, and think about how we can provide better resources just as an industry while following copyright laws. But my punchline for APJ's members is always we've got to first understand what, if any, changes to your procedures might be impacted by these new versions. If it's just additional considerations or expansion of the standard versus changes to the standard, we have to understand that, right? If it is expansion, like new materials or new considerations, that hopefully doesn't impact your existing procedures. But if your existing procedures are impacted, one, you need to make that change. And then two, you need to think about what qualifications might change as a result to the change. Do you need to requalify anyone to a new standard, basically, or a new procedure? So
Thank you for that.
stay
And
tuned,
yeah,
hopefully. Yeah.
yeah, and more coming. But as you mentioned,
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry.
thanks, AI.
The phone's talking to me.
Well, you mentioned that they're publicly available. And I think we checked this one, and a lot of these organizations like ASTM or API will call these reading rooms, and you can go onto their websites. Anyone in the public can do that. Usually, you do have to create an account, a free account, and you can, get onto there and view these standards. So ASTMs, I believe, if I remember right, didn't even require an account. They are publicly available in their reading room. We'll drop a link in chat, include that in our recap email for your own subject matter expert review. But moving along, there was one IBR from the National Fire Protection Agency, NFPA 70 National Electric Code, and two from the Plastic Pipe Institute on hydrostatic design. Anything of note on those?
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. And I'll note that NFPA does also provide free digital access to NFPA 70 through its website, nfpa.org. The Plastics Pipe Institute does the same at plasticpipe.org. And last of these direct final rule IBRs, we have some updates from the American Petroleum Institute, or API, the recommended practice 1170 and 1171. We have more ASTM standard references for welding, non-destructive testing, and piping specifications. And I'll note API is at least some of these, again, currently available in their reading room now, such as the 1170, 1171. More stay tuned, Erin?
Yeah, I will say, just to kind of, for the underground storage standards, my understanding is, again, remember we talked about this idea of adverse comments. The agency, their comment period closes soon, if not today. Gosh, I'm getting my September dates a little bit fuzzy at the moment. But even and with the intention that these new versions of the standards would go into effect on January 1st of 2026. So the idea is you would have basically 4 months to update any standards and get them ready for compliance in your own procedures and obviously your own qualifications by January 1st of 2026. That's pretty aggressive, right? And so, however, we, the industry, like that the agency is moving forward on incorporating these via direct final rule. So I do not anticipate any type of comments requesting a deadline extension beyond January 1st of 2026, because that would be viewed as an adverse comment. However, the agency does have other tools in their toolbox, like notices of enforcement discretion. If over the next 4 months, the agency says, you know what, we were pretty aggressive on that 4 month timeline. Yes, we'll have it go into effect on January 1st of 2026, but we will use enforcement discretion potentially on your incorporation of these standards beyond that compliance deadline of January 1st. And so I guess a little bit of stay tuned, but I do think, especially because of the underground storage, it really fleshes out some of the integrity management aspects of those assets. That while I guess one would, this is where that whole IBR kind of purgatory, is it in, is it out stuff kind of comes to a head. Is sure, a lot of those operators have been eager to move towards the new additions, but unless and until the agency says go do it, they kind of are stuck in a kind of limbo state. And so now that they have been given the signal, 4 months is pretty aggressive to still to kind of do all that stuff. And so I guess if I was in Vegas, I would say I wouldn't be surprised if we see some enforcement discretion notices come out of the agency between when this comment period closes. I think today. I know the ANPRMs, or is it? I don't know. The 9th, it
For
might
some
be
reason I thought it was the 8th, but
8th or 9th. I know
don't have it in
yesterday
front of me
was
either.
some of the NPRMs. I don't know. It's hard to keep track sometimes. But anyway, yeah. So while they will go in effect on January 1st, 2026, assuming no adverse comments are received between now and next week, I do think that the agency might give us a little bit of wiggle room as an industry to really get our feet up under us with all these standards.
Well, thanks for that. Let's move now to the notice of proposed rulemakings that were announced. There were 6 issued in the Federal Register on July 1st. We're going to go a little deep into a couple of these and really high level on the others. First, we have atmospheric corrosion reassessment for pipeline replacements. Erin?
Yeah, this was one that we submitted comments on yesterday jointly with the American Gas Association and the Northeast Gas Association. Really appreciate the agency kind of recognizing a corner of the regulation that didn't quite make sense. This goes back actually to the first Trump administration's regulatory reform efforts, where the industry was able to successfully demonstrate why performing atmospheric corrosion checks on a 5-year cycle in conjunction with leak surveys made sense for most operators, right? That had not identified atmospheric corrosion as a threat on their system. And so we were able to do that, but there was kind of almost like this savings clause, if you will, that was added at that time that said, hey, listen, if you are finding atmospheric corrosion on an asset, we think you should revisit that asset in 3 years instead of 5 years. It was kind of like all right, fine, we'll do everything. We get to do everything else in 5 years. We'll go back to these assets that we found evidence of AC on in 3 years. Well, obviously, several years later, that's become annoying to keep up with that. You know, you do an entire service area, right? And you've got these 6 above ground, whatever, meter sets, risers, whatever, that have evidence of AC on it. Now I've got to go visit those in 3 years, where I get to visit everything else in 5 years. And it's just a paperwork and compliance nightmare. And so the agency kind of said, okay, listen, if you're going to replace that asset, you shouldn't have to come back in 3 years. It's in fact, it's a brand new asset. You shouldn't have any AC on it, right? And so appreciate the thought. The wording was a little funky, saying the entire, like, unless the service line, we're not going to dig up the service line if there's some AC on the riser, right? So industry submitted comments yesterday basically saying, hey, listen, unless the affected portion of the service line is replaced or repaired by removing AC and adequately coating to protect against AC in the future. A little long-winded, but we think the intent is the same. And so we're pretty confident that the agency will agree with us.
Thank you for that. Next, there were a pair of transmission NPRMs, eliminating burdensome and duplicative deadlines for gas pipeline coating damage assessments, and harmonized class location change pressure test requirements with Subpart J pressure test requirements. A little mouthful there.
Yeah.
What do you have for us on these?
Yeah, I do know that my transmission friends are going to submit some comments. Again, this is an NPRM, so we don't have to worry about adverse comments kind of bearing down on us. This is going to go through an advisory committee filter. And so my understanding is that the transmission folks are going to submit comments or submitted comments on the pipeline coating damage one. Again, this was meant to be just like a tidy up of the fixes, and I did not participate in that comment development, but I'm sure they have even further refinement fixes. I have not heard anyone discussing submitting comments on the Subpart J, but perhaps the transmission folks decided to do that as well.
Well, thank you for that. There were two NPRMs, I believe, applicable to gathering operators, exception for in-plant piping systems, and codify enforcement discretion on incidental gathering lines. Erin, have you heard anything from that industry sector's trade groups on these two as far as?
Yeah, this is where kind of another, it's like you move through the supply chain and you have different groups representing these folks. I don't want to speak on their behalf. I haven't popped into, I should have done that this morning, Chris. I should have popped into the docket to see what they submitted. This is just the agency trying to, for once and for all, kind of put where the demarcation between regulated and unregulated is, both on gathering and plant piping. Really, this is somewhat rooted, I believe, in some, I guess, disagreements on where that jurisdictional line lies. And it really is sometimes rooted in when Congress promulgates, or excuse me, when Congress mandates that the agency perform actions on certain regulated pipelines. And of course, Congress is not super explicit sometimes, even sometimes we hope that they are, and sometimes we don't. So I guess we should be careful what we ask for. But it's been problematic, both for industry to understand where that line is, but also for the agency to kind of constantly be discussing that with folks. And so I think we see them trying to, at least via rulemaking, clean it up and be explicit. And so appreciate them trying to do that through these rules.
Well, thank you. Finally, Erin, the last one of the NPRMs that were issued on July 1st, rationalizing of special permit conditions. What do you make of this one?
The special permit conditions is a bugaboo that has bothered those that have utilized special permits. So a special permit is when a pipeline operator says, hey, this little corner of the code is problematic for me for XYZ reason, and therefore I'm going to try to meet the intent of that pipeline safety regulation by doing A, B, and C, right? And so I need your permission to not do that and do this instead. And if it was that simple, you would probably see people try to utilize the special permit process more often, right? Unfortunately, it over a couple decades became this very, very clunky process that said, hey, I want permission to do something slightly different because I don't know, can't access the pipeline or some other reason. And so I'm going to do this instead. I'm going to find corrosion in this way instead. Well, what started happening is the agency was saying, okay, yeah, you found corrosion, but we're still worried about the pipe. So we want you to do these 10 things in addition to whatever you're doing instead to find corrosion. And it was becoming this laundry list of actions that an operator would have to take that really started to fall outside of the scope of the ask. If the ask is, I want to find corrosion this way instead of that way, and now you're making me do a lot of other things that have nothing to do with corrosion, it started to become an untenable solution for operators. And so this is where you see the agency saying, hey, listen, we want to narrow what you can ask for in a special permit and what we can ask of you by giving you permission via a special permit to only things that are directly and substantially related to the relevant standard or regulation being asked for. So really trying to kind of narrow the scope of these special permits. And then that way they're more workable and usable for those one-off scenarios that people ask for.
Makes sense. Awesome. So still another NPRM. We'll hear about more coming beyond all of the July 1st notices, which achievement we've made it through them. PHMSA also issued recently an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. I think it was titled "The Mandatory Regulatory Reviews to Unleash American Energy and Improve Government Efficiency." Again, like you said, ANPRMs are seeking public comment on whether to and this one specifically, whether to repeal or amend any specific requirements in the rulemaking or the program procedures or the regulations to, quote, eliminate undue burdens on the identification, development, and use of domestic energy resources and to improve government efficiency. So I'll note that the comment period closed earlier last month, August 4th, with what appears to total around 60 comments. And Erin, in your experience on the regulatory reform, where does the industry tend to focus their comments?
Yeah, I'll go on I know we have 4 minutes and I'm trying to help us race to the finish line.
We're going to go over, but yeah.
I feel like regulatory reform is a bit of a tightrope for me. And I get that we've all got our bugaboo issues that are problematic for various operators for various reasons. But when we're looking at like a wholesale federal regulatory change, we have to always do that balancing act, right? Which is, it's the change I'm seeking going to maintain or even improve pipeline safety, and I better be able to justify that, right? And so that's hard. That's a hard bar, right? Do we think things are a pain in the butt and maybe not worth, is the juice worth the squeeze always? I think we can find a lot of stuff that we're like kind of questioning, is the juice worth the squeeze? But to me, that's not the question being asked. The question's being asked, can I peel this off and still sustain the level of safety that I had when it was there? And so that's why we see the pipeline trades often submitting comments related to reporting and not all, and very sometimes surgical changes to pipeline safety regs. And rarely do we go after kind of big swaths of changes or even kind of that atmospheric corrosion check change. That was a big one. But we were able to show that over I think 30 years, there are exactly 4 reportable incidents related to atmospheric corrosion, including no fatalities and 1 injury by an operator or personnel. And so AC is just not a big threat on the distribution system. It just isn't. And so anyway, those are hard to find, right? And so a lot of the comments that were submitted by industry were related to reporting, really questioning the agency on whether or not the agency was actually utilizing the data and the information that was being submitted, or if there was a better way to submit it, or a less data needed to kind of accomplish the same goals.
Well, that seems to align with, we ran all the public comments data and the documents that were submitted through AI, and the analysis basically found similar themes. So the commenters were identifying outdated definitions, duplicative rules, small system requirements were especially called out as being overly burdensome.
Yeah.
That created high costs and delays. And even strain across, the state regulators commented as well. And, suggested reforms included updating the definitions, adopting modern technology, providing flexible class location approaches, easing rules for the small systems. So while the supporters were emphasizing efficiency and cost savings and enhanced safety through risk-based processes, critics warn that streamlining could weaken statutory protections. So that's basically the conversation that the PHMSA is now going to be going through. And as we heard, I guess the next step would be some kind of NPRM related to.
Yeah.
I just want to note there are several NPRMs still out there that we're not covering today: class location, distribution, safety, leak detection, and repair. I know we're running on time, so anything to mention on these, Erin?
Yeah, for many of us, we just spent 4 years of our lives thinking about the leak detection and
Still
repair
are, yeah.
rule. And we were really, really close to it being our living reality. I do think that, again, the administration staff that showed up at PHMSA in late January, they had their mission of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, of the things they wanted to tidy up. That is the flurry we saw this summer. And then now my hope and I think my understanding is now they get to start being a little bit more surgical and circling back on some of these rules that are left hanging, and including the leak detection and repair. I do think that any, if not all of these, we could anticipate something called a supplemental proposed rule, which is something kind of in between a notice of proposed rule and a final rule, where the agency has made enough changes to the original proposed rule that they want to seek further comment on before going to final rule. And so maybe that is what is on deck in 2026, is seeing where this administration lands on some of these rules.
Well, thank you for that. So now is your time. You can put questions and answers into the Q&A feature in Zoom. I think we're going to be out of time to answer those live, but if you put your information in there, we can get back to you. So put your email address if you do have any questions. We'll note that this webinar is open to the public, but if you're an ITS client and you're finding value in today's webinar, Erin, you can with Erin. You can hear even more from her live in person as she speaks at our ITS user conference later this month in Nashville, Tennessee. It's hosted at the downtown Hilton, and that's on September 30th through October 1st. And I'll share more about that in a moment. Let's recap what we do. Our 5 takeaways, our top 5 takeaways. First, review and understand the IBR updates and when they go into effect. It'll be beginning of next year, unless adverse comments are received, and they could affect your O&M procedures. Understand your reporting process. Check with your state regulator to see when your state deadline for annual reporting is set compared to the changing federal process. Some of the recent notices were common sense administrative changes that hopefully may simplify operations. The recent technical corrections and amendments may impact your O&M and record-keeping procedures. And remember to engage with your trade associations and participate in that public commenting process. So important for industry to do that. Don't forget about the opportunity for getting CEU credits. Again, a recap email, you can fill out a form. You can receive a certificate for 0.1 hours. If you're an ITS client as well, we have a webinar coming up on September 24th, introducing a new option to store non-destructive and destructive testing certifications in the ITS platform. You can reserve your spot today with that QR code on screen. It's going to go away quickly. Again, mention the user conference in Nashville. You can find out more information at itstraining.com. Sign up, get an agenda. We'd love to see you there. It's a lot of fun down in downtown Nashville. And no open questions have been submitted. So, Dave, someone just said thank you. So we did a good job, I guess. No real questions out there. Erin, I can't thank you enough. Went through a lot today, ended about on time. Join us next time where we're tentatively scheduled for December 3rd. And thank you again, Erin, for lending your expertise. Thank you all for tuning in, and remember to stay safe.
Thank you, Chris.
Have a good one.